How worried should we be about the danger of nuclear war on the Indian subcontinent? In this new season of Upfront, I'll ask acclaimed Indian novelist and activist Arundhati Roy. I'm Mehdi Hassan. Also on the show, Venezuela's political and economic crisis is deepening under President Nicolas Maduro, and the US and over 50 other nations say they want him out. So, are we now on the verge of a military intervention? That's our debate. But first, India and Pakistan became the first nuclear powers to launch airstrikes against each other after the recent violence in Kashmir. Tensions remain high, but many in India have been celebrating Prime Minister Modi's aggressive stance, giving him a boost before the country's upcoming elections. One of India's most famous novelists and human rights activists, though, says Modi is part of the problem, not the solution. This week's headliner, Indian literary legend Arundhati Roy. Arundhati Roy, thank you for joining me on Upfront. Tensions between India and Pakistan are at their highest for decades. A lot of your fellow Indians would say that you should be standing with your country, with your government, with your Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. But you've come out against him again. Why?
Well, I've always been against Prime Minister Modi, even at the time he was the Chief Minister of Gujarat in 2002. But right now, I feel that, he has been extremely reckless in what he did by doing those sort of symbolic airstrikes after the Pulwama attack. India and Pakistan became the first two nuclear powers to bomb each other, to put the whole world into jeopardy because of a problem that they have not just been unable to solve, but have actually been perpetuating for so long. And that problem is in Kashmir.
You've also said that Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan, quote, acted with dignity and rectitude throughout this crisis. Many others around the world have praised Prime Minister Khan as well. But shouldn't he also be held responsible, a lot of Indians would say, for being in charge of a country that has failed to crack down on groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed, which took responsibility for that attack on Indian personnel? Just a week after the attack, a global financial watchdog said that Pakistan still, even under Imran Khan, is not doing enough to stop the funding of terrorism and money laundering and the rest.
Yeah, well, I was only speaking about that particular moment when we could have flashed into war. I was not commenting on Pakistan's role in the whole Kashmir dispute, which is a complicated one, and of course, to take action against groups like the Jaish is a responsibility of Pakistan. But history did not begin with Pulwama in Kashmir. So I think we need to look at that the whole world needs to turn its attention to Kashmir because we are in a very, very dangerous situation there.
Isn't the problem, though, that the rest of the world is more concerned about nuclear war than about the plight of the Kashmiris?
Well, I mean, if they care about nuclear war, then they'll have to care about the Kashmiris, And frankly, it's not just that they care about nuclear war. Here, you're looking at an economy like India and a country like Pakistan, both great buyers of weapons and, things that keep that military-industrial complex in the West ticking. So there are very serious reasons for why people have looked away. But now with this, I don't think you can look away anymore.
Just on the Indian press and the conflict in Kashmir, how much is the Indian media and the very nationalistic cable news channels that we see from afar, how much do you think that's to blame for all this tension and hostility? Are Indian journalists complicit in ramping up some of these tensions?
Well, they are more than complicit. Sometimes they are literally calling for war. I mean, you had a major television anchor saying, we don't want condemnation, we want blood. You know, one of the most terrifying things in India now is that you have something like 400 24-hour news channels. I mean, even if this government falls, those media channels will remain, and openly lying, publishing fake news, knowing that it's fake news. Some of those channels are owned by weapons dealers who have a vested interest. Most are owned by major corporates. The biggest corporation in India owns 27 24-hour news channels, you know. And so the conflict of interest is unbelievable.
Let's talk about what's happening on the ground in Indian-administered Kashmir in particular. The suicide bomber at the center of this recent escalation, Adil Ahmed Dar, he was reportedly humiliated by police officers while in school. He was shot in the leg during violent 2016 protests. When he joined a group of fighters in March 2018, his family told reporters, and the Indian military's response was to raid their home, set it on fire. Now, no one's justifying what he did, but how different would the reaction in India be to his story if more people knew about his story and more people knew about what's happening on the ground in Indian-administered Kashmir?
There's nothing special about that story. That's the story of average young Kashmiri men. And that's why everything is so dangerous. You know, it's not, what I'm saying is beyond the question of posturing and condemnation and nationalism now. You did have senior journalists saying we can have a limited nuclear war. For heaven's sake. I mean, in Punjab, the peasants burn their crops. You can't breathe in Delhi. And they're talking about limited nuclear war. It's a situation of absolute lunacy.
And what is your position on Kashmir? Are you for independence?
You know, I am nobody to say what should happen to Kashmir. My position is that Kashmiris should be given a chance to express their opinion fearlessly. What do they want? Why are we so scared of that?
No, I get that they should have the final say, but you're not just a novelist, of course. You're a political analyst. If you could wave a magic wand, what would you do?
To me, if I could wave a magic wand, I would say that you need to demilitarize and you need to ask the people that have been fighting since 1947, what is it that they want? You know, why have 70,000 people died? Why are hundreds of teenagers been blinded? Why have so many people been tortured? For what? Why are people willing to kill themselves? Why are civilians willing to come in the way of bullets when the army cordons off a militant and people just throw themselves in the path of danger? Why?
So just to be clear, if the Kashmiris did get a vote and they voted for independence from India and from Pakistan, let's say, you would support that? You would say you're not opposed to breaking up that part of India?
Look, I'm not any kind of person who believes in the sanctity of maps. I mean, if Indians believe that it's all right for them to intervene in Bangladesh and to separate what was then East Pakistan from West Pakistan and liberate that place, which was being assaulted. There was genocide being committed in Bangladesh. If Indians believe that that's okay, then in what way do they justify their position on Kashmir?
You've been accused by your army of right-wing critics in India of being, among other things, an apologist for militant groups in Kashmir, as well as India's Maoist fighters too. You once said, "I do feel it's incredible that these poor people are standing up against this mighty state." What is your position on minority groups taking up arms against the Indian government, which for all its sins and flaws is an elected government?
Well, you know, I ask those people, like, if you go to the to the villages as I have been, deep into the forests of central India, 4 or 5 days walk from the main road, where you have vigilante armies raised by the government plus paramilitary forces surrounding indigenous people's villages, burning them down, raping the women, chasing people off the land in their tens of thousands. What do you want those people to do? In the middle of the forest, go on a hunger strike when they're already starving? What do you expect them to do? Obviously, I'm not just suggesting that everybody picks up arms and starts shooting people, but if there's non-violent protest, it's not allowed. If there's armed resistance, it's not allowed. All of us are supposed to be okay with that and maintain the status quo. Sorry.
India's elections begin in just a few weeks. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has exploited the recent crisis with Pakistan. We're seeing a lot of nationalism, xenophobia on the part of government ministers. Is he going to get re-elected with this kind of rhetoric and campaign, do you think?
Quite honestly, I don't think so, because the situation here is that everything is in crisis. Farmers are in crisis, universities are in crisis, banks are in crisis, courts are in crisis. I don't think it's going to work unless something else happens, and something else may well happen.
You have said in the past that the opposition party, the Congress party, has, quote, done by night what the BJP, Modi's party, does by day. 5 years into this Modi era, is that really still your view of Congress, that they're basically all the same?
That's a very tough question to answer, because one looks back at the history of what the Congress has done and you do shudder. However, Modi is not the problem. Modi is a representative of the most powerful organization in India, the RSS, with hundreds of thousands of volunteers. It's the cultural guild that controls the BJP. It was set up in 1925. It has always maintained that the Indian constitution is a foreign constitution. It has always maintained that India should be declared a Hindu nation. So now we are in that sort of crisis.
And the RSS's politics and Modi's politics, would you call that the Hindutva politics? Would you call that kind of politics fascist?
Well, the RSS itself, its own ideologues have written so much in praise of Hitler, in praise of Mussolini, have called Muslims second-class citizens, have called Christians and communists their enemies. If you look at the games that have been played, the false flag attacks, the trail of deaths, of murders, of lynchings, you see fascism. What else do you see?
Isn't the really big problem for you and people who are opposed to Modi is that Modi still has the support, according to the recent polls, of the majority of Indians? You're in a minority as a critic of his. Isn't that the big problem?
It's a problem, but the thing is that majoritarianism and fascism only have an osmotic wall between them. So in the last elections, they proved that they didn't need Muslims. In this election, they're going to try and prove they don't need Dalits. And, the caste equations in India is something we haven't spoken about, but caste is the engine that runs this country. And I don't believe, Modi didn't come to power with the majority of the votes anyway, but, there are thousands of people in jail today. The killers of Gujarat, people who have been held guilty of massacring, 90 people, let's say Naroda Patia in 2002, Babu Bajrangi, who was convicted and who actually openly boasted on camera that he slit open a pregnant Muslim woman's stomach, recently been released on bail, whereas human rights lawyers, professors, activists, indigenous people in their hundreds are in jail.
And you yourself were imprisoned in the past for your protests against the Narmada dams. You've been very outspoken in your criticisms of both parties, of the military, of police forces, of violence. You've been criticized for that, obviously. You've been smeared. You get death threats. Do you worry for your life, Arundhati?
I'm obviously careful. I am somebody who's protected by my readers in some ways. That's all the protection that I have. But it's happening to so many people, you know. People have been killed. Of course, Gauri Lankesh and so many others have been killed. So it would be silly to say, oh, I don't worry at all. But all of us worry. All of us are careful. All of us step back sometimes. All of us try to live in this country in the most intelligent way that we can and say what we can, how we can, when we can.
Arundhati Roy, thanks for joining me on Upfront.
You're welcome, you're welcome.
More than 3 million refugees, an economy in freefall, and more than 50 nations around the world, including the US, demanding the president stand aside to make way for the opposition leader. Venezuela is in a serious crisis. So, is it time for Hugo Chávez's successor, President Nicolas Maduro, to step down? Or will a US-backed change in the government in Caracas constitute a coup? Joining me to debate this are Ava Gollinger, a Venezuelan-American lawyer and journalist who served as an advisor to the late President Chávez, and Eli Lake, an American national security and foreign policy columnist for Bloomberg, who says regime change is the only moral option. Thank you both for joining me in the arena. Ava, let me start with you. It isn't just the US. You have Canada, France, Germany, the UK, the EU Parliament, Venezuela's neighbours, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Ecuador. They have all endorsed Juan Guaido as the new president, the opposition leader. In terms of both the global scene and the regional scene, President Maduro doesn't have much legitimacy left, does he?
He is the current president of Venezuela who's in power. He's in the presidential palace. He won an election last year under, questionable circumstances that can be contested by the opposition. They chose to boycott it for the most part. But he is in power. He has the support up until now of the armed forces, at least at the higher levels. And he has control of the state institutions. So there is also support for Maduro. I mean, absolutely, there are millions of Venezuelans who have supported him and may not be content with the current situation in the country, but don't support, the kind of coup-like situation that's taking place.
Eli, he's the elected president of Venezuela. He's in the presidential palace. Who cares what other countries think?
Well, I don't think he is the elected president of Venezuela. His election didn't pass any kind of international muster. Almost all the countries that you mentioned did not recognize that election. There were significant members of his opposition, most notably Leopoldo Lopez, who was in jail and could not run. The reason that the opposition boycotted that election is because they had seen slowly but surely under Nicolas Maduro's reign, an erosion and an attack on the very powers of Venezuelan democracy, particularly the National Assembly, which he basically neutered and then sort of revived an old forum and called it his new legislature, which undermined a very legitimate election in 2015 when Maduro's opposition won a majority in that assembly. That is the basis or the roots of this crisis. So when we talk about is Maduro elected, well, I would say that the election that was held in 2018 was not legitimate. No one recognized it.
But you wouldn't deny that millions of Venezuelans still support this president, would you?
Sure, there are millions of, though I do think that he is losing his support in the areas that were the strongest supporters of Chavez, in part because the entire economy has collapsed. But yeah, there are millions of supporters. He has far less, I think, legitimacy and popular legitimacy than he did before.
You wrote on Twitter last month, Eli, that, quote, regime change is the only moral option in Venezuela right now. You said calls for compromise are delaying the transition to democracy. Given that this phrase regime change,
sure.
We're speaking the week of the anniversary of the Iraq invasion, when invoked in the US, that phrase is associated with Iraq, with Libya, with hundreds of thousands of innocent people being killed. Should people in the US really be talking about regime change in the same sentence as Venezuela?
Well, I think that regime change should be destigmatized. I think it's the outcome that we're talking about. The means by which I support regime change in Venezuela is to have a new election under an interim government and for there to be, a vote, and whoever wins should do that. My issue with Maduro in this particular context is not because I think that the U.S. should invade Venezuela as they did in Iraq. He has usurped power by staying past his first term. And, I don't recognize, as most of the hemisphere doesn't recognize, the last elections.
Okay.
Except
do you disagree with anything that Eli said?
Well, absolutely, because, regardless of my position on Maduro, which is critical, there are millions of Venezuelans who did go to the polls and vote for him and believe that he is their elected president. So the fact that Juan Guaido, who was also elected as a member of the National Assembly, the fact that he's claiming and that the opposition is claiming, and primarily, even though the other countries are involved and present in Latin America and Europe, it's really the Trump administration that is pumping up the opposition. They would not be able to take this as far as they have so far without that open and direct, explicit, and very aggressive support. So I think that's a key factor, because you may have Venezuelans who don't want Maduro as their president. They would like change.
But they don't want a U.S. intervention either.
Absolutely not, nor do they want a U.S. puppet. So they don't, and they see Trump in the same way that many people around the world see Trump, which is this emblematic, figure of U.S. imperialism and capitalism.
Okay,
well,
Eli,
I think that I would quibble with one thing that you said just then, which is that the original driving force of this entire process was a sort of Venezuelan Supreme Court in exile and what's known as the Lima Group, which the U.S. is not a member of. And so I would say that, yes, the Trump administration, by coming out and saying that they supported this, but it was done in consultation with all of these other countries in the region.
But the other countries aren't the ones who might take military action. You say you're not in favor of military action.
I don't think the U.S. will either, but we
know that Donald Trump and John Bolton don't have an objection to military intervention.
Are constantly saying that the option's on the table also.
I mean, Donald Trump told the former
up.
acting FBI director, why can't we go to war in Venezuela, quote, they have all that oil and they're right on our back door. That doesn't worry you as someone
Plus,
who's
he's said
writing about
multiple
Venezuela?
times since then that a military option is on the table. He said it just the other day, meeting with the president of Brazil.
I mean, if you were Maduro and you heard that, what would you be doing?
I would say that my understanding from reporting, and I think there's been some public statements to this as well, especially from Elliot Abrams and stuff and so forth, is that they say that all options are on the table in order to dissuade Maduro from doing something rash, such as attacking the U.S. embassy, which is now the U.S. is evacuating its personnel, or from doing something like arresting Guaido. And as we saw this week, we saw the arrest of his chief of staff. So I think that it's mainly a form of public diplomacy. Donald Trump has shown in his broader foreign policy that he does not like committing the United States to wars. In fact, he'd like to brag about ending them. We saw that in Syria. We're seeing that probably soon in Afghanistan.
But we've also seen him make very hawkish noises on Iran and Venezuela. I'm just wondering here, you mentioned Elliot Abrams.
Yeah.
I mean, again, if you're Maduro, if you're a member of the Venezuelan government or a supporter, you see that the point man on Venezuela, appointed by the Trump administration, is the guy who was involved in Central America under Reagan with El Salvadoran death squads, genocide in Guatemala, etc. Regardless of your own positions on Venezuela, what message is that sending to people in Venezuela?
Also, threats of military action that's not diplomatic discourse. That's war discourse. So, of course, the position of the Venezuelan government of Nicolas Maduro is going to see that as a direct threat. Why wouldn't they? There have been assassination attempts.
Eli, is it fair to say, well, I want regime change in Venezuela, but I don't support military intervention, given Maduro has the support of the defense minister and the security? He's not going anywhere anytime soon. So if you really wanted to get rid of him, you would get behind kind of Trump, Bolton, Abrams, regime change, military change.
I don't think Abrams and Bolton are spoiling for an invasion.
So why is he holding a notepad saying 5,000 troops?
And also,
I think it's a form of
invasions.
psychological warfare. But more importantly,
and that never leads to real war, does it?
But
okay.
more importantly, I think he's trolling the press and trying to sort of send messages. More importantly, I don't think things are very good for Maduro right now.
Ava, if you're the Prime Minister of Canada, you're the Prime Minister of the UK, you're the President of France, you see this humanitarian crisis, you see this record number of refugees, you see people taking to the streets protesting the government, you see the opposition leader saying, well, according to my understanding of the Constitution, I can be interim president. You've already said the election was flawed on behalf of your national government. What are you supposed to do? Just avert your gaze? What would you want them to do?
I think absolutely. There should be diplomatic pressure. There should be efforts to facilitate dialogue, a negotiated process. But again, I mean, there's a crisis in Venezuela, but and not to downplay or underestimate the experiences of any Venezuelans going through hardships, it is not a humanitarian crisis that we would call, for example, Yemen. It's not a situation where we're looking at a famine. Yes, there have been more refugees or an exodus of Venezuelans than ever before in history, but a lot of those are economic refugees, and that's again not to underestimate their own hardships. There is still, you go to Venezuela, and if you go to the remote regions, you're going to see, like more rural, you'll see the impact of the crisis more. But in the city, you still got people, they're going, I mean, if you were to go visit today, you would say, what has the media been telling me?
I mean, the hyperinflation in Venezuela is a humanitarian
Absolutely. Well, the
crime, and it is
hyperinflation
a
is
crime
real.
that can be put at the...
What is the solution going forward in terms of ending this crisis?
I would say absolutely. There needs to be facilitated negotiation. The Chavista side must take part in any kind of...
Negotiation to what end, though? You're not being clear as to what's the end point of those negotiations. Is it new elections? Is it Maduro's...
There should be new elections that should take place at some point, but to get
which
there...
Which Maduro can contest.
To get there... Well, I don't think... Personally, I don't think he should participate. There are plenty of other candidates that should play a role, but I think that the main point is that the Chavista side must be included because it represents, still to this day, a majority of people in Venezuela. They cannot be excluded, they cannot be repressed or isolated.
Do you disagree with that solution?
Well, I don't think there should be negotiations with Maduro, period. I think that the international community should remain strong, and I think that there should continue to be encouragement of negotiations between many of the Chavista politicians, many of the Democratic opposition politicians, and the leadership of the military.
You just ignore the president?
No, to eventually come to an agreement that says that we are unified, that we no longer want
if
to be
that doesn't
misruled by Maduro.
And
well,
if that
let's
doesn't work?
revisit it in 6 months.
Well,
but I think that over time,
in
that
a year,
will
they
work.
could call for a recall referendum, but then they'd have to recognize the legitimacy of his presidency. But there is a figure in the Constitution that would allow for his term to be recalled.
We'll have to leave it there. Ava Gollinger, Eli Lake, thank you both for joining me on the show. That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.